You've probably heard this 100 times. World War II began when Germany invaded Poland. Yeah, that's what the textbooks say. But here's the crazy part. That's not actually where it started. Not even close. The invasion was just the moment the world finally noticed what had already been building for years. Anger, betrayal, secret deals, in a world too tired to stop another dictator. Because before the tanks rolled, before the bombs fell, the stage was already set by broken promises, global depression, and a peace treaty that was never really peaceful. This isn't the story you learned in school. It's the story of how the biggest war in human history started long before 1939, and how everyone saw it coming but did nothing. Let's rewind and see how the world accidentally lit the fuse for World War II. Everyone thinks they know how World War II started. Germany invades Poland, Britain and France declare war. Boom, global chaos. That's the version we've all heard in school. But here's the thing, that's just the headline. That's the explosion, not the spark. The truth is, the war didn't suddenly begin in 1939. It had been brewing for years. The warning signs were flashing like bright red lights, and the world just ignored them. Think about it. A peace treaty that left millions bitter and broke. A global economy in ruins, dictators rising out of desperation, and leaders making secret deals behind closed doors. It's not one event. It's a chain reaction of bad decisions, missed chances, and fear. And here's what'll really blow your mind. The first shots of what became World War II were fired long before a single German tank crossed the Polish border. We're about to rewind time and uncover how the real start of World War II didn't begin with Germany, or even in Europe, but with a world that set itself up for disaster long before 1939. Ready? Let's go back to the moment the first domino was tipped, right after World War I, when the world thought it had finally found peace. So let's rewind. It's 1918. The First World War has just ended. The world is exhausted. Europe is basically one big hospital. Cities are in ruins, families are broken, and millions of young men never came home. Everyone thought that was supposed to be the war to end all wars. But instead of healing, what followed was chaos disguised as peace. When the fighting stopped, the victors sat down to write a peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. It was intended to prevent another world war from happening again. But honestly, it did the opposite. Picture this. You've just lost everything, and instead of being helped back on your feet, you're handed a bill for everyone else's damages. That's what happened to Germany. The treaty forced them to accept full blame for the war and pay massive reparations. Basically, a mountain of money they didn't have. Additionally, the map of Europe underwent a complete redraw. Whole empires, like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, were chopped into pieces. New countries popped up overnight. Borders shifted. Millions of people suddenly found themselves living under new governments they hadn't voted for or even spoke the same language as. And while this was happening, something else emerged, the League of Nations, an early precursor to what we now think of as the United Nations. Its job? Keep the peace. Sounds great on paper, but in reality, it had no real power, no army, no way to stop anyone from breaking the rules. It was like having a referee with no whistle. Meanwhile, back in Germany, people were furious. Their economy was collapsing, prices were exploding, and unemployment was everywhere. Families were burning money for heat because it was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Seriously, imagine going to the store and seeing the price of bread change before you finish paying for it. And over in Italy, people were angry too. They'd fought on the winning side in World War I, but they didn't get the rewards they expected. They felt cheated. Across Europe, that frustration mixed with fear and pride started to grow. The world thought it had ended a war, but really, it had only ended a battle. The next one was already beginning to take shape, quietly in the background. So while the 1920s rolled in with jazz music and optimism in places like America, Europe was sitting on a powder keg of resentment, debt, and political instability. And when a world is tired, broken, angry, it only takes one spark to set everything off again. And that spark? It began with a single piece of paper, the Treaty of Versailles. So let's talk about that piece of paper. The Treaty of Versailles. On the surface, it was supposed to bring peace. But to Germany, it felt more like a punishment than a treaty. You see, the people who wrote it, mainly from Britain, France, and the United States, wanted to ensure that Germany could never start another war again. So they struck them. Germany had to take full blame for World War I, something called the War Guilt Clause. That's basically saying everything was your fault. Additionally, they were required to pay reparations, substantial payments to the countries that the war had harmed. How massive? Over 132 billion gold marks, which, if you adjusted for today's value, would be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And remember, this was a country already in ruins. Their economy was shattered, their industries destroyed, their people starving. It's like punishing someone who's already drowning by throwing them a few more weights. The result? Pure resentment. The German people didn't just lose a war, they lost their dignity. And humiliation can be one of the most potent fuels for revenge. Within Germany, the government at the time, known as the Weimar Republic, was attempting to establish a democracy. But it was fragile. Inflation skyrocketed. People's life savings evaporated overnight. There are actual photos of kids playing with stacks of banknotes like toy blocks because the money was literally worthless. And this humiliation wasn't just about economics, it was psychological. France, still bitter from World War I, sought to exact a heavy price from Germany. Britain was torn. They wanted peace but didn't want to fight France over it. The US eventually pulled away from European affairs altogether. So Germany was left alone, cornered, angry, and broke. That's when dangerous ideas start sounding appealing. People began longing for a strong leader, someone who could restore their pride, bring back jobs, and make them feel powerful again. And when someone finally stood up and promised all that, people listened. His name? Adolf Hitler. Hitler didn't rise to power because people just wanted war. He grew because he understood their anger. He tapped into their sense of injustice. He told them what they wanted to hear. You were betrayed. You were humiliated. And I can fix it. And honestly, after years of shame and poverty, millions believed him. So while the rest of the world thought the Treaty of Versailles had ended the Great War, what it actually did was leave a wound that never healed. It turned peace into punishment, and punishment into rage. And that rage was about to collide with another disaster, one that hit not just Germany, but the entire planet. Because next came the Great Depression. By the late 1920s, the world was already shaky. Germany was buried under debt, people were jobless, and faith in democracy was fading fast. But then, boom, came a disaster no one saw coming, the Great Depression. It started in the United States in 1929 when the stock market crashed. One day fortunes were made, the next they vanished into thin air. Banks failed, businesses shut down, millions lost their jobs overnight. And because the world's economies were now connected, that crash didn't stay in America. It spread like a virus. Germany, already hanging by a thread due to the Versailles reparations, was hit the hardest. U.S. banks had been lending money to help Germany rebuild, but when the crash came, that money stopped. Suddenly, factories closed, unemployment exploded, and hunger became part of daily life. Imagine this, entire families standing in bread lines for hours to get a single meal. Parents are selling furniture or jewelry to buy food. People carrying their last few coins, wondering if they'd still be worth anything tomorrow. And this wasn't just happening in Germany. In Britain, factories were shutting down. In America, farmers were losing their land to dust storms and debt. In Japan, trade collapsed, and military leaders started saying, if we can't buy what we need from the world, let's take it. That's when things got really dangerous. Because when people lose their jobs, they get scared. When they lose hope, they get desperate. And when desperation takes over, they start listening to anyone who promises change, no matter how extreme the solution sounds. In Germany, that anyone was Adolf Hitler. He promised to rebuild the economy, restore national pride, and throw off the humiliation of Versailles. To ordinary Germans who'd lost everything, he didn't sound like a madman. He sounded like a savior. In Italy, Mussolini had already been doing the same, shouting about strength, empire, and destiny. And over in Japan, militarists were whispering the same thing in the emperor's ear. Our future depends on expansion. The Great Depression didn't just destroy economies, it destroyed faith in democracy. Suddenly, the world wasn't run by reason anymore. It was run by emotion, fear, anger, pride, or shame, or revenge, all boiling just beneath the surface. And this wasn't some isolated storm. It was global. You had a broken Germany, a frustrated Italy, a rising Japan, and a world that just wanted stability. Any stability. That's when totalitarianism, dictatorships, began to look like the answer. By the early 1930s, while the rest of the world struggled to survive the Depression, a new kind of leadership was quietly emerging, one that didn't talk about peace or compromise, but about power, conquest, and destiny. And in just a few short years, that mindset would explode into action. As Germany, Italy, and Japan each decided they were done waiting for the world to fix itself, the age of dictators had arrived, and the world was about to pay for it. By the early 1930s, the world wasn't just struggling, it was desperate. Democracies were failing, people were starving, and everyone was looking for someone, anyone, who could make things better. And that's when a new kind of leader stepped into the spotlight. Not the calm, diplomatic type who talked about compromise, but the loud, confident ones who promised strength, unity, and glory. Let's start with Germany. After years of humiliation and chaos, along came a man who told people exactly what they wanted to hear. It wasn't your fault. You were betrayed, and I can make Germany great again. His name, of course, was Adolf Hitler. In 1933, he rose to power, and almost immediately everything began to change. He banned rival political parties, silenced critics, and built a cult of personality around himself. Propaganda filled the streets, posters, parades, and speeches painting Hitler as Germany's savior. And with every cheering crowd, his power grew. Behind the scenes, Germany was secretly rebuilding its military, something strictly forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler didn't care. He rearmed anyway, training soldiers, building tanks, and producing weapons under fake programs. And the shocking part? The world knew. Britain and France knew, but they didn't act. Nobody wanted another war, so they just looked away. Meanwhile, down in Italy, another man had already figured out how to turn frustration into power: Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had been in charge since the early 1920s, calling himself Il Duce, which means the leader. He promised to restore Italy's old Roman glory, to make the country feared and respected again. Under his rule, the trains ran on time, the press was censored, and anyone who disagreed disappeared. He marched his supporters, the black shirts, through Rome, showing off power, discipline, and pride. And when Mussolini looked beyond Italy's borders, he saw a chance to expand. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, one of the few independent African nations left. It was a brutal campaign, modern tanks and aircraft against soldiers on foot. And when the League of Nations tried to stop him, he ignored them completely. Because what could they really do? Nothing, no army, no enforcement, just more words. And on the other side of the world, a third power was rising: Japan. Japan underwent a rapid transformation since the late 1800s. It was industrial, ambitious, and wanted resources to fuel its growing empire. However, when the Great Depression struck, Japan's economy plummeted. The military saw its chance. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northern China. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, so Japan quit the League just like that. By 1937, Japan was at full-scale war with China, capturing cities, bombing civilians, and committing horrific atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians were killed. And again, the world did nothing. By the late 1930s, three nations, Germany, Italy, and Japan, had risen to prominence. A dictator rules each promising to restore national greatness. Each was convinced that expansion and war were the answers. And together they formed an unspoken alliance, one built on ambition, revenge, and the belief that the world's rules no longer applied to them. You can almost picture the world map of the time. Three storms forming in different corners of the globe, all spinning faster, all moving toward the same explosion. And while the dictators grew bolder, the rest of the world kept waiting, hoping they'd stop on their own. But history doesn't reward hesitation. It punishes it. And as Germany, Italy, and Japan began testing the world's limits, the so-called peacekeepers, the League of Nations, were about to prove just how powerless they really were. By the time Germany, Italy, and Japan began flexing their muscles, the world actually had something in place that was supposed to prevent all this from happening: the League of Nations. On paper, it sounded perfect. After the horrors of World War I, world leaders had said, never again. So they created this international organization meant to maintain peace, settle disputes, and prevent aggressors from starting another war. But here's the thing. A peace organization only works if everyone respects it. And by the 1930s, nobody really did. For starters, the United States, yes, the same country whose President Woodrow Wilson originated the idea, never even joined. That alone weakened the League from the start. How can you lead the world in peacekeeping when one of the most powerful nations isn't even in the club? And when trouble started brewing, the League's weaknesses became painfully apparent. Let's rewind to 1931. Japan invades Manchuria, a region of China rich in resources such as coal and iron. The League of Nations holds meetings, writes reports, and condemns Japan's actions. But that's all they do. No troops, no sanctions that actually hurt, no real consequences. So Japan shrugs, quits the League, and continues its invasion like nothing happened. That was the first big test, and the League failed it. Then came 1935. Mussolini's Italy invades Ethiopia. The world watches as Italian bombers drop poison gas on villages, and thousands of innocent people die. Ethiopia's emperor, Haile Selassie, even travels all the way to Geneva to beg for help, standing before the League, pleading for justice. And what does the League do? They talk. They debate. They issue weak sanctions, banning things like rubber and metal. But conveniently, they don't ban oil, the one resource Mussolini's war machine actually needs. Oui, because Britain and France, the League's most powerful members, were too afraid of pushing Italy toward Germany. They wanted to keep the peace, even if that meant letting a dictator get away with invasion. And once again, the message was clear. You can break the rules and nobody will stop you. So the League of Nations, the world's big hope for lasting peace, turned out to be more like a debate club than an absolute global authority. Every time an aggressor crossed the line, the League hesitated. Every time they chose discussion over action. And the dictators noticed. Hitler looked at Japan and Italy and thought, if they can get away with it, so can I. So in 1936, Germany marched troops into the Rhineland, a region that was supposed to remain demilitarized entirely under the Treaty of Versailles. That was a direct violation of international law. But did anyone stop him? Nope, not a single country. Even Hitler admitted later that if France had intervened, if even one soldier had pushed back, he would have ordered his troops to retreat. But nobody did. And just like that, the League of Nations lost whatever credibility it had left. It became apparent that this so-called system of collective security was just an illusion. The world's peacekeepers couldn't keep the peace. And that's when dictators everywhere realized something chilling. The world was too scared of war to stop them from starting one. The stage was set, the warnings were ignored, and as the League stood by, paralyzed by its own fear and indecision, the world was inching closer and closer to its next catastrophe, one that would make World War I look small by comparison. By the mid-1930s, Hitler was testing the world, sending troops into the Rhineland, building weapons, and whispering about reclaiming lost territories. And the reaction from Britain and France? Hesitation. They called it appeasement. Fancy word, right? Basically, it meant giving Hitler what he wanted, hoping he'd be satisfied and stop there. Britain, still scarred from the First World War, didn't want another conflict. France was nervous too. Their military was unprepared for another major war. And the general public? Terrified. People still remembered the slaughter of trenches, the mountains of dead, and the grief that followed. So when Hitler demanded the Sudetenland in 1938, part of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population, Britain and France said, okay, fine, take it. Just don't go any further. This led to the Munich Agreement, a meeting in which Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously returned home waving a piece of paper, declaring he had achieved peace for our time. The crowds cheered, the newspapers celebrated, and Chamberlain went to bed thinking he had stopped a war. But here's the shocking truth. Hitler didn't see it as peace. He saw it as weakness. Every concession, every compromise, every moment the world let him take what he wanted made him bolder. The message was loud and clear. The democracies were afraid, and fear was an invitation. Within months, Hitler had moved beyond the Sudetenland, taking over all of Czechoslovakia by March 1939. Suddenly, appeasement looked like surrender. And yet, the world still hesitated. Britain and France had hoped diplomacy would keep Hitler satisfied. They hoped that by giving in, they could avoid war. But when dealing with someone who's already rewriting the rules, giving in doesn't calm the storm. It fuels it. Meanwhile, Hitler was planning his ultimate move, the invasion of Poland. And as history would show, that one act, the one everyone thought started the war, was really just the first unavoidable consequence of years of missteps, fear, and indecision. Appeasement wasn't just a policy, it was a fatal gamble, a bet that the world could control a man who had no intention of following rules. And the world was about to lose that gamble. By 1939, Hitler had already demonstrated that appeasement was effective. Britain and France had given him the Sudetenland Armenian. Czechoslovakia had fallen. And now he was looking at Poland, the final piece he wanted before taking Europe by storm. But there was a problem. Poland was sandwiched between Germany and the Soviet Union. Invade it, and Germany risked a two-front war, the very nightmare Hitler had promised to avoid. So what did he do? He made a plan. And here's where it gets shocking. Hitler, the ultimate anti-communist, the man who hated the Soviet Union and called it his mortal enemy, signed a secret pact with Stalin. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty. On the surface, it appeared to be a handshake between enemies. But secretly, they agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, all carved into spheres of influence. Think about that for a second. Two ideological rivals who had spent years hating each other were now plotting together, secretly deciding who would get what land, and the world had no idea. Hitler could now invade Poland without worrying about a Soviet attack from the east. Stalin got time to prepare and expand his own territory. Both men were playing a high-stakes chess game, and the rest of the world was the board. When the pact became public, it shocked everyone. Allies were stunned. Even Germany's own people were uneasy. How could their leader ally with their sworn ideological enemy? But Hitler didn't care. He had removed the biggest obstacle to his plan. With one piece of paper, he had effectively guaranteed that the invasion of Poland would be unopposed by the Soviets, at least for now. And he didn't waste any time. On September 1st, 1939, German tanks rolled into Poland. That invasion, the one most people think of as the start of World War II, was really the explosion at the end of a long fuse. Broken treaties, economic collapse, appeasement, and secret deals had lit the fuse. And the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? It was the final chess move that made the war unavoidable. September 1st, 1939. Germany's tanks rolled across the border into Poland. For most of the world, this marked the beginning of World War II. But for those paying close attention, it was the inevitable result of years of tension, mistakes, and miscalculations. Poland had been weakened by its location, stuck between Germany and the Soviet Union, and by the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which meant Hitler didn't have to worry about a fight on two fronts. The invasion was fast, brutal, and coordinated. German forces employed a new strategy called blitzkrieg, or lightning war, which combined tanks, planes, and infantry to strike quickly and overwhelm the enemy. Cities fell, railways were cut, and communication lines were destroyed. Within weeks, Poland was essentially divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. And then the dominoes started to fall. Britain and France had warned Hitler that invading Poland would trigger their defense treaties. They didn't want war, but they couldn't appear weak either. So on September 3rd, 1939, both nations declared war on Germany. Suddenly, the conflict that had been building quietly for a decade exploded into a global war. What had started as a local invasion became the opening act of a conflict that would engulf Europe, Africa, Asia, and eventually the entire world. Every step along the way, the harsh Treaty of Versailles, the economic collapse of the Great Depression, the rise of dictators, the failures of the League of Nations, and the policy of appeasement had created a chain reaction. Each misstep made the next one almost inevitable. And now the fuse had burned all the way down. The world had hoped to contain the storm. It had hoped diplomacy and caution would be enough. But the storm couldn't be stopped. The war had already started, and there was no going back. In the next few years, this chain reaction would spread further than anyone could have imagined. Nations collapsing, millions dying, and the entire world being reshaped forever. And it all began, not with a single act of aggression, but with a series of choices, misjudgments, and risks that nobody fully understood at the time. So far, we've been following the chain reaction in Europe, Germany rising, Italy pushing, the appeasement that failed. But here's the thing, World War II wasn't just a European problem. It was global. Take Japan, for example. While Europe was squabbling over treaties and borders, Japan was already in motion. They had been expanding into China since the early 1930s, capturing Manchuria, attacking cities, and committing atrocities on a massive scale. Their goal? Resources. Japan had little oil, iron, or farmland of its own, and it needed to feed a growing population and fuel an ambitious empire. So while Europe feared war, Japan was already waging one, completely independent of Hitler, but perfectly aligned with the chaos his rise created. And then there were the colonies. France, Britain, the Netherlands, and even the United States had territories across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Once Japan started invading China and later Southeast Asia, suddenly these colonial holdings became targets, pulling nations from multiple continents into conflict. Meanwhile, in Africa, Italy's ambitions weren't limited to Ethiopia. Mussolini dreamed of creating a new Roman Empire across North and East Africa. British and French colonies became strategic battlegrounds as the European conflict spilled into their overseas territories. And don't forget the United States. At first, they tried to stay neutral, watching the disaster unfold from across the Atlantic. But Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 changed everything. Suddenly, the U.S. was fully drawn into both the Pacific and European theaters, turning what had been a regional conflict into a global war. Even the Soviet Union, initially part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany, became a battlefield after Hitler turned east, invading in 1941. Europe was no longer contained. The war reached every corner of the globe, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Southeast Asia, from the islands of the Pacific to the cities of Russia. That's why World War II wasn't just a European story or a story of dictators. It was a truly global event, touching the lives of millions across continents and oceans. The decisions of the 1930s, broken treaties, economic collapse, failed diplomacy, and the rise of aggressive powers didn't just light the fuse in Europe. They created a chain reaction that engulfed the entire world in fire. And this global scale is why the consequences were so massive, why the war reshaped borders, politics, and societies everywhere, leaving scars that lasted decades after the last shot was fired. So here's the truth. World War II didn't just start when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. That was the moment the world saw the explosion. But the fuse had been burning for over a decade. It started with the harsh Treaty of Versailles, which humiliated Germany and left a wound that never healed. It was fed by the Great Depression, which devastated economies and left people desperate for strong leaders. Then came the rise of dictators. Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, militarists in Japan, each promising glory, pride, and power, taking advantage of fear and frustration. And every time the world hesitated, every time appeasement or weak diplomacy was chosen over action, the fuse burned brighter. The League of Nations failed to stop aggression. Secret deals, such as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, reshaped alliances in the shadows. And every misstep, every act of inaction, brought the world closer to inevitable conflict. By the time Germany invaded Poland, the outcome wasn't uncertain. It was inevitable. Europe and the rest of the world were already caught in a chain reaction of resentment, ambition, and fear. Poland was simply the spark that lit a global explosion. And that's the key lesson here. Wars don't start in a single day. They start with small choices, with mistakes left uncorrected, and with the world thinking it can avoid trouble until it's too late. So the next time someone tells you World War II started in 1939, you can say to them the real story. It started years before, with a series of events, decisions, and failures that all stacked up until the world could no longer escape the consequences. Understanding the real start of the war isn't just about history. It's about seeing how tension, fear, and inaction can build over time, and how the consequences of ignoring warning signs can be catastrophic. The war didn't just happen, it was set in motion long before the first shot was fired. And that's the story the textbooks often leave out.